Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today we're talking about Dragonflight healers, and this is going to be a purely discussion based video. We'll be talking about my opinions about which aspects make healers great or meta, how the community perception is shaped. We'll be talking about the utility, we'll be talking about damage, healing, all of those things. This is a discussion based video. If you have any opinions, if you disagree or agree, or how do you feel Blizzard should approach the healing game in the next expansion. First of all, before we get started, again, a mandatory disclaimer, because I do have to mention this. Unless you're pushing really high-end content or pugging for rank 1 mythic plus achievements and things like that, I don't think you should focus on meta or best healers. I think you should play the healer that you enjoy the most, because believe it or not, a lot of the times the difference between the best healer and the worst healer might not be as big as the community make it out to be. And on top of that, Dragonflight is introducing quite a few utility abilities for healers, and we'll talk about it. But first of all, I want to talk about the things that make healers meta. And I think there are 3 things that I need to talk about here, and I don't think every healer needs to be the best at each one of these aspects to be meta, but it does help. So there is such a thing as a healer meeting healing requirements. Surprise, surprise, a healer has to heal. Now, this kind of concept has been diluted throughout the expansions, because you do have to deal damage as a healer, you do have to provide utility, and healing requirements, again, if we look at Season 3 in Shadowlands, in Mythic Plus, the healing requirement was really low. Every single healer was able to meet the healing requirement in every single dungeon. This led to other aspects playing a bigger or more important role in terms of determining what healer is going to be great, aka damage. And all the sudden healers that could provide the most damage, whether it's going to be through their personal DPS by dealing damage, or providing utility, something like PI. And we'll talk about PI or Power Infusion, because it is making a comeback in Dragonflight, and I still think it's going to be somewhat toxic, or a big portion of when determining priest viability or meta capabilities. So healer being able to meet healing requirements has been a big thing, because again, in Season 3 I talked about Mythic Plus healing requirements really low. In Season 4 Shadowlands, you started to see the Mythic Plus healing requirements being increased vastly. All of a sudden, bosses like Morrows, things like Shadowlands, if you keep people alive, you're going to beat the boss and you're gonna time the key. And all of a sudden, a lot of the healers, or healers who could provide more HPS, were valued a little bit higher. So this leads to my next point. Healers are only perceived to be meta based on the content that they're doing. If they're doing a Mythic Plus content or raiding content which requires a huge amount of healer checks, there is going to be a different community perception around that. And this begs the question, and I really want to know your opinion about this, and this comes down to Season 3 in Shadowlands versus Season 4 Mythic Plus. Do you want Mythic Plus to have big healer checks where a healer feels like a healer? Because if you keep people alive, doesn't matter how much damage you do, if you keep people alive, you will kill the boss and he will time the key. Or do you want to go back to Season 3 where you're spending probably majority of your time DPSing, and a lot of the times you almost feel like an off healer? Based on my early testing in Mythic Plus in terms of Dragonflight, a lot of the scaling was a little bit off. The first week of Mythic Plus testing, you were not scaled up and things like that, so even a plus 10 would feel like a plus. It would feel a lot harder, but then after all, scaling came into effect and the plus 10s were really easy. But the initial requirement, or the healing requirement, felt pretty, how do I say, it felt pretty rough. There were a couple of bosses or trash bags where you would actually have to pump HPS in order to survive those mobs. And I like to think that even with higher key levels scaling, and the scaling is being changed in Dragonflight in terms of Mythic Plus, there will be a pretty substantial healing requirement, at least on few of the Mythic Plus dungeons that I got to test. So just to quickly summarize some of the aspects that I consider to be important for a healer. Now, healer checks. You need to make sure that your healing class can meet the healing checks, and that is going to be dependent on content that you're doing. And that is also going to be dependent on how Blizzard is going to tune Mythic Plus and raiding content. On top of that, healers do have to provide damage in the highest content if you're trying to push high Mythic Plus keys or trying to do Mythic raiding. And again, if you're not meeting the DPS check, healer DPS is going to be a thing. And that involves evaluating healers' true DPS output, whether that's going to be through direct means of healer just doing damage, or providing utility like Power Infusion or Holy Paladins got Blessing of Summer, and we have to see what is the total DPS value from that. And then another aspect of healers is going to be utility. Certain healers have better utility. Now, every healer provides something in terms of utility, but not everyone is made equal. And this is where we're going to Evoker, because Evoker is is a new healing class being introduced in Dragonflight, and where does Evoker fit in terms of niche and utility? I actually genuinely feel that Blizzard doesn't even know at this point where to bring Evoker, because I think initially they really thought they wanted Evoker to be this mid-range healer, not melee, not range. They had a 25-yard range on majority of the heals. They got moved up to 30, and then on top of that, last day or yesterday they added Echo being instant cast without having a cast time, which also begs the question, what other spells are you going to cast during your hover besides Living Flame, which maybe they're going to allow empowered abilities to be cast during hover, which again we'll have to see. But this is just to summarize the fact that Blizzard is not 100% sure where to push Evoker right now, because there was a lot of negative feedback about Evoker's range limitations. There was feedback about the fact that Evoker doesn't provide utility that is absolutely mandatory. Now, Evoker does have a raid buff, Blessing of the Bronze, which again provides cooldown reduction to your major movement ability, which is pretty nice, but it's not really mandatory compared to something like a Resto Druid's Mark of the Wild, which gives you 3% versatility. That kind of party or raid buff, especially in Mythicless environment where verse is one of the best stats, is absolutely insane. But Blizzard kind of saw that and they were like, okay, Evoker doesn't have enough utility, their niche is kind of slipping away from them, let's give them Bloodlust or Heroism, which makes a lot of sense because they were lacking something. And Bloodlust is absolutely huge in something like Mythicless environment where you only have 5 people, and getting Bloodlust might not be as easy as it sounds. But when you compare it to raid environment, there's a very high chance that there's going to be multiple classes to provide this utility. So Evoker's raid utility, I still don't think there is a huge niche or raid utility they provide that will get them invited to every single raid or race to world first, but that can absolutely change. So now we established there are 3 things that make healer meta, and you don't have to have all of those things. You don't have to be the best DPS healer or the best healer in terms of HPS or the healer that provides the most utility to be brought in the race to world first or highest Mythicless keys done, because there are multiple examples of healers that provide 2 of those out of 3. And they become super strong. As an example, you can look at Sepulchre in terms of Holy Priest. Now, Sepulchre logs are really misleading because most of the Race the World First content was done with 1 legendary, then 2 legendaries unlocked, and then some of the healers popped off in terms of pure HPS. But the initial best healer, the healer that was brought to most raiding environments in terms of Race the World First for Sepulchre was Holy Priest. And Holy Priest HPS was very strong. It was comparable to a lot of other healers with 1 legendary, and they didn't provide the most utility. They did have Symbol of Hope, which can be pretty strong, but they had PI. And now this brings me to the discussion of external buffs, and the main culprits here is going to be Power Infusion for Priests, which is coming back in Dragonflight, and you also have Blessing of Summer for Holy Paladins. Holy Paladins are also, or Paladins in general, also getting Balres, which is another boon to their utility toolkit, especially in something like Mythicless environment where getting Balres might be a little harder. I do have to look at engineering Balres as well. I haven't looked into professions too much, so we'll have to see how that's going to work, whether it's hard to obtain or how it is to use. But Blizzard did see issues about Power Infusion and whether it should be brought back in Dragonflight. There's a lot of people against it. I think in a perfect world, Power Infusion does add class fantasy to Priest because you're a support type of healer, you're adding value, but we're not living in a perfect world. We're living in a world where people are trying to get the highest prices possible and trying to optimize every single percentage, and Power Infusion can become a toxic, almost a toxic ability in certain situations. But Blizzard did end up bringing it back in Dragonflight at the cost of some utility. Priest is the only healer that does not have Interrupt, and they did lose certain utility abilities like Shining Force and things like that, and that's what I call the PI tax. Blizzard looked at their performance, they looked at their utility toolkit, and they were like, okay, if we're bringing Power Infusion back, there needs to be some cost associated, at least this is my opinion, there needs to be some cost associated to Priests, because they have this huge utility ability that can bring a huge value. I am speculating here, but I'm assuming that Power Infusion is also going to be insanely strong in Dragonflight unless it gets nerfed. Now, to finish off this segment, we talked about certain things that can make healer meta. We talked about healers meeting healer checks. We talked about healers doing damage and utility. We also talk about damage reduction cooldowns, but I think that fits raiding even more. And you also have to consider that a healer could provide the most utility in the game, but they don't meet the HPS requirements or they don't meet the DPS requirements when compared to other healers, and that was a prime example of Resto Shaman at the start of BFA in terms of raiding, where Resto Shaman still had Spirit Link and healing cooldowns and things like that, but their overall output wasn't strong enough. And to lesser extent, you could say the exact same thing about Resto Shaman in Dragonflight. They do have a good class tree, a good spec tree, they do have a lot of utility, but they could use a simple aura change to provide more damage and HPS, and they would climb immensely in a lot of these healer tier lists. Let's talk about raiding and what makes healer great in raids and things like that. I don't want to ramble on too much. We'll talk about Dragonflight, we'll talk about my predictions, a little bit of my predictions, and we'll talk about previous data from Shadowlands. And what you see right now on your screens is Sepulchre Mythic Raid HPS rankings. Now, HPS does not define healers the best or worse and things like that, because at higher end, healers need to provide utility, HPS, and damage. But these are somewhat misleading because Sepulchre raised the world first. A lot of the progression or race was done with single legendary, and the HPS meters were different. And the second legendary came out, and you saw healers like Druid and Mistweaver running away with HPS. And this feeds into the age-old discussion. For the longest time throughout expansions, Blizzard was, how do I say, a lot of the healing, the pure HPS, this is not tracking damage reduction cooldowns. That's very important distinction. It's not tracking Aura Mastery, the 15% damage reduction that Holy Paladin can provide, or 3% damage reduction that he provides consistently with Diva Aura. So things like Barrier for Discipline Priest, things like Spirit Link and stuff like that, there's a lot of things that are lacking from this list. But for the longest time, people were very angry about the fact that in previous expansions, Holy Priest and Discipline Priest would provide the same amount of HPS on top of the fact that they would have damage reduction cooldowns, which did not show in this meter, and they would also be very strong in terms of dealing damage because they would deal damage passively while healing. So there was a lot of hatred towards Discipline Priest and Holy Paladin. And I think that in the last expansion, or at least the very end of Shadowlands, Blizzard looked at this and they were like, okay guys, maybe these healers don't provide damage reduction, but they're going to be pumping pure HPS. And if you have a raid fight which requires huge HPS requirements, don't look at Resto Druid's passive damage, don't look at Resto Druid's lack of damage reduction, look at how much it can carry in terms of pure healing. And then all of a sudden you might actually be inclined about inviting Resto Druid because you just want to meet the HPS check. And now this is another point of discussion that I want to ask you guys. How should Blizzard handle Dragonflight raid HPS? Should healers that don't provide damage reduction do more healing? Should healers that provide damage reduction do less? Is that how Blizzard should balance healer raid performance? Because again, there's a lot of other things in the mix here. Things like power infusion, if their counting is a big part of their utility, it's not going to show up here. So looking at pure HPS for healers is not the best way to determine meta healer, but should Blizzard head the same direction that they did at the end of Shadowlands and go in the same direction in Dragonflight? Now, a big disclaimer, I have been talking to some of the guilds in terms of possible raid rosters emerging. Anything can change right now. Spell tuning is still ongoing, and a lot of the healers got nerfed in the last couple of days, but there is a lot of things to be said about double Discipline Priest or Discipline Priest and Holy Priest being included in a roster right now, because power or shield meta or shielding meta for Priest could be very strong. Aegis or Rat did get a nerf, but the baseline power or shield got an increase. So we have to keep an eye out on this absorbs, because if absorbs are going to be really strong, Discipline Priest or multiple Discipline Priests could be considered for a lot of these raiding environments, especially top end raiding environment. And again, Priests in general, they still have power infusion. Power infusion, I can almost bet you, unless something happens to power infusion, it's going to be a very strong utility tool. A very strong, there's always going to be at least one or couple of classes that are going to benefit a great amount from getting power infusions all the time. A lot of people have been talking about Holy Paladin because their niche of tank healing has always been strong, especially at the start of an expansion. We have to look at the tank balancing, and I think a lot of the viability for Holy Paladin is going to be based on whether tanks need a huge amount to sustain healing. If there's going to be multiple tanks in a raid that are getting wrecked all the time, Holy Paladin and the passive tank healing that they provide could solidify a spot in raiding roster for them, regardless if they're pumping out HPS or not. I think Holy Paladin is doing pretty well right now in Dragonflight. Even with the spell tuning, anything can change, but the fact that their niche is pretty strong, I think a lot of guilds will have at least one Holy Paladin. Again, take this with a pinch of salt. And then a lot of raiding guilds were considering to have at least, or finishing off the raid roster with either Mistweaver or Resto Druid. I think a lot of people were looking at Resto Druid because their HPS was really, really strong. But guess what happened in the last couple of days? Every single healer that I talked about here has been nerfed. Resto Druid was nerfed, Mistweaver was nerfed, Holy Paladin was nerfed, Priest were nerfed. And that left Resto Shaman and Evoker. Resto Shaman and Evoker, I think the hype for them was a little bit lower in Dragonflight, especially in raid content, because even though Resto Shaman was providing a bunch of utility, their numbers in terms of healing or DPS were not there compared to everyone else. But you can change that with one simple aura change, and all of a sudden Resto Shaman could be tough. The same could be said for Evoker to a lesser extent, because I think Evoker's utility is not as strong as Resto Shaman. Evoker does have absorbs with things like Temporal Anomaly. They do have that raid movement speed buff. They do have Zephyr and things like that, but I don't think their utility is all that, or even niche is all that amazing. The whole point of the last segment was to showcase that Blizzard is keeping their ear to the ground in terms of what healers are emerging in that raid meta, because they know that the community is going to look at race to wall first, they're going to look at the healers that they're bringing down, and that effect is going to trickle down in lower end guilds. I do think that the healers that I talked about in terms of being strong or possible raid rosters emerging, I think that will change. I think Blizzard is going to look at how to include every single healer, especially Evoker. I don't think they know exactly where they want to head with Evoker, but I don't think they want Evoker to be a healer that's not used anywhere, because it is the flagship feature of the new expansion. I find it fascinating. I find the whole process of which healers are considered to be good or bad. The whole process is really interesting because there's so many different things at play here. And there's multiple questions in this video that I want you to answer, or I want you to give your opinions about. First of all, Mythic Plus. How do you want the encounters to shape out? Do you want Season 3 or Season 4? Do you want Mythic Plus to have very low healing requirement where you're spending most of the time DPSing and you're considered as a support healer more than a pure healer? Or do you want Season 4 or the emergence of Season 4 healing requirements where your main goal is to keep people alive, because there's going to be 1 or 2 bosses in every dungeon that are insanely hard in terms of pure HPS or healing checks, and then all of the rest of the time you're basically spending DPSing or providing damage, but healing checks are there. And lastly, I want to know your opinion about the raid HPS meta. Do you want to have a similar direction that you had in Shadowlands, where you had healers that don't provide damage reduction cooldowns doing more HPS? Is that the way forward in Dragonflight? Is that the way to have the best healer balance? Again, guys, this is a huge video. This is very long video. There's a lot of things to talk about here. I'm really interested in your opinions, and let me know, where do you think the game should be heading when it comes to healing? If you like this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next